My name is Silas Krabbe. I'm the author of a beautiful bricolage, Theopoetics as God Talk for Our Time. It's a survey of theopoetic writings and authors and trying to distill and show and demonstrate what the discourse of theopoetics is. Theopoetics eschews clear and rigid definitions, so maybe it's best to say that theopoetics is a type of play that involves theological reflection and our being and how we interact with a text and how we're formed by a text. So it's an entire way of engaging the material, both the writing and the content, in an understanding that what's communicated is not only what is said, but is also how it's said. And those both are communicating something and drawing the reader into the questions and into the mystery that surround the divine and God and what we mean when we speak about God. In the book, I mostly focus on the 20th and 21st century and authors that are using the term theopoetics, but if one was to consider the tradition more broadly, one could always see theology and poetry connected. From the Psalms to hymns in the New Testament, there's a deep connection with trying to speak around the mystery. And so this is also in the tradition. If you think about writings like Augustine's Confessions, which is framed as a prayer to God, a confession of belief, but also as praise, as confession towards God. And so one might say Augustine is playing in the theopoetic realm by doing that. And people have been reading that work for centuries now because when an author writes that way, it draws us into forming our identities. So people look at Augustine's self-autobiography, but as a prayer, it's before God, and he reflects upon his existence as a person before God. So even in that era, you can see theopoetics working, or Athanasius' use of theosis, or God forming, is a compound of theopoesis, or theopoion, which is God making. So man, or God became man, so man can become God, Athanasius said. And in that, it's that forming of identity before God. And then in the modern times, and then in the Enlightenment, we become fascinated with certainty, with pinning things down, with propositional statements, and having clear reference. And we lose sight of some of the forming or making that is a part of our God talk. So the theopoetic writers are calling us back to some of those understandings that were earlier in the Christian tradition prior to the modern times, but more so focusing on moving it forward. So it's not just a return narrative to go back to what was, but how can we, in our postmodern context, be focused on writing in ways that form identity, or where God becomes in our writing? You might want to say that God becomes our speech, or God is rightly fitted to our speech, or God comes to be in our speaking. And in that understanding, the interpretation is more open, the play of the language is more inviting. It draws the reader in, not to understand clearly, but to experience and be moved by the text. In the modern era, I think we became, in the global West, fascinated by object thinking, mostly because of Descartes. And we project that onto our God talk, and we speak about God more so as object than as subject. And an object can be defined, or a statement can be made toward the object that approaches it. But if God is not an object, and we're going to be critical of our underlying deism, which haunts us in the Western church as thinking about God as super being or as a thing to be described. The subject calls us and invites us into the mystery. And I think that's necessary both to explore humanity and life, because there's a lot of mystery in loving someone or being invited into someone's life. You never quite understand that person fully. And so if that's our experience of existence and of love and of relationships, how much more does that mystery fit God, or what we think about God, or how we're called into that relation with what is utmost and what matters to us the most. And so I think that mystery is not trying to cover over a rational discourse, but it fits both a pre-rational and a post-rational sphere, in that trying to articulate our deepest desires requires a more poetic phrasing, requires us to be a little bit less certain about how to speak about those emotions. And also, when our scientific and rational discourses kind of end, we wonder on the other side. So on the other side of the rational, we enter this post-rational wondering. Theopoetics doesn't offer certainties. Instead, it kind of makes love or engages to our questions, to the unknown. And so a question calls us towards something, but in Theopoetics, we don't chase after an answer or the ghost of an answer that we can never quite grasp. Rather, we follow after the question and understand that an answer would be the end to the journey that a question opens up. And so instead of using the language of answers, I play with a process theology term of aims, where we're directed towards something, but we don't necessarily shut down the question at that point. The question invites us to go on a journey with it, to keep talking about it, to keep heading where you're going. But this doesn't mean it's an anything goes kind of situation, because if we think about our lives and reflect upon our lives, there's things that I don't want to repeat, and there's things that call me and invite me and directions I want to head. And so it's with that kind of framing we can shape and aim toward where we're going. But like shooting a bow and arrow, just because you aim the arrow doesn't mean that you're going to hit the target. The arrow might be blown by the wind, or something else might happen, and just because you set an aim doesn't mean that's where you're going to end. And so with that, Theopoetics doesn't have an end place to reach. It understands ourselves as being historically situated, contextually situated. And so since we're not at the end of history, we are not going to come up with a final solution, a final answer. But that doesn't mean we don't speak and write and wonder. So Theopoetics invites more writing, invites more wondering. And the style of writing and the way of being of Theopoetics draws the reader into that. And in the book, I use the metaphor of a river as something that you plunge into no matter where you're going. And you can learn to swim, or you can try and construct ways out of it. And Theopoetics is resisting the building of boats or bridges or mooring places, but rather learning how to swim in our existence and in our curiosity towards God. And we have the option of walking along the riverbank, but at any point the riverbank might collapse, and that solid place that we thought was safe might plunge us into the river. And so Theopoetics is a way of kind of preemptively inviting someone to come swimming, come into the river, learn how to paddle around, so that when something tumultuous happens or you're caught in a rapid of life, you can swim a little bit better, wonder a little bit deeper, and experience life more fully. In the 20th century, Stanley Hopper first used the term theopoesis in a speech to the American Academy of Religion. And he was using it more so as this way of talking about rephrasing our metaphors or revitalizing our language around God. He talks about a step back, a step down, and a step through, so that rather than confronting our God talk with logic and rationality, we step back into wonder, down into existence, and through into what can come. And from there, the term surfaces in a number of spots, but mostly around Syracuse and Drew universities, where this way of wondering and this way of speaking around God without such certainty kind of lived. And in the book, I trace out a number of different places where this term has popped up. And so it's popped up in the world of hermeneutics with authors like John Caputo, who's doing radical theology and deconstructive hermeneutics. And it also has popped up with authors like Rubem Alves from Brazil, who became so disenchanted and disillusioned with the Protestant Western way of doing theology that he returned to Brazil and started speaking about life in a passionate way, an erotic way, in a way that suits his existence. And then it also has come up with process theologians like Catherine Keller, who use the term and fit it with this becoming, that God comes to be or is calling us into the future and drawing our language into these apophatic or unknown places. And so it's a response to the masters of suspicion who thoroughly deconstruct what we had known about Christianity or what we thought we had known. And then it also kind of arises after the death of God theologians of the 60s who talk about God in different ways, following after people like Tillich, where God is the ground of being and inviting us into those kind of mysteries rather than speaking about God as object.